Welcome, sailor. In the icy silence of Alaska's Inside Passage, a routine ferry ride turns into a ticking time bomb. When a hidden crack in the ship's aging hull explodes into catastrophe, 247 lives hang by a thread. No rescue in sight, just steel, seawater, and the fight to survive. This isn't a voyage, it's a race against death.
My name is David Chin. What happened that day wasn't supposed to be possible. The Alaska Marine Highway System is a lifeline for Southeast Alaska, connecting communities scattered across an archipelago where roads often don't exist and airplanes can't always fly. The Northern Light was one of the smaller vessels in the fleet, 285 feet long, built in 1974, designed to carry 350 passengers and 130 vehicles through the protected waters of the Inside Passage. She wasn't glamorous. 4 decades of Alaskan service had left her functional but weathered, with the practical aesthetics of a working vessel rather than a cruise ship. The passenger accommodations were Spartan, airline-style seating, a small cafeteria, and sleeping berths that most people only used on the longer routes. But she was reliable, seaworthy, and perfectly suited for her mission. The Northern Light has been making this run since before you were born, Captain Maria Santos told me when I joined the crew in 2017. Santos was a 25-year veteran of Alaska Marine Highway, one of the first women to command a ferry in the system. She's not pretty, but she gets people where they need to go, and she's never let us down. The crew was small for a vessel carrying hundreds of people. Myself as second officer, Chief Engineer Tom Bradley, First Officer Jennifer Walsh, and a deck crew of 6, plus the galley staff and passenger services personnel. We'd worked together for 3 years, developing the kind of seamless cooperation that makes complex operations look routine. The February 14th departure. February 14, 2023, started like any other Tuesday in Southeast Alaska. Overcast skies, light rain, and temperatures hovering around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. We were departing Juneau at 8 a.m. for the 4-hour crossing to Sitka, carrying a typical winter load of locals, a few hardy tourists, and the usual collection of vehicles that needed to move between communities. Passenger manifest shows 247 souls aboard, First Officer Walsh reported during our pre-departure briefing. Vehicle count is 89, including 3 RVs and 2 commercial trucks. Weather forecast calls for light winds and seas 2 to 4 feet in Chatham Strait. Should be a smooth crossing. The passenger load was typical for February, mostly Alaska residents traveling for work, medical appointments, or family visits. Unlike the summer tourist season when the ferry carried capacity crowds eager to see glaciers and whales, winter passengers were people who needed to be somewhere, not people looking for an adventure. Among the passengers were Sarah and Mark Rodriguez, a young couple from Sitka returning from a medical appointment in Juneau. They were traveling with their 6-month-old daughter Emma, who had been born premature and required specialized care only available in the state's capital. The Rodriguezes represented exactly the kind of passengers we served. People for whom the ferry wasn't transportation, it was necessity. There was also Dr. Patricia Kim, a physician traveling to provide medical services in Sitka's rural clinic. James Tompkins, a construction supervisor moving equipment to a building project. The Nakamura family, grandparents visiting their new grandson in Sitka for the first time. People with lives, families, reasons for being on the water that had nothing to do with maritime adventure. The Inside Passage. The route from Juneau to Sitka takes the ferry through some of the most spectacular scenery in North America. Mountains rise directly from the water's edge, their peaks snow-covered even in summer. Glaciers calve icebergs into channels that have been carved by ice over millions of years. Eagles soar overhead, whales surface beside the ferry, and the forests come right down to the tide line. But in February, much of that beauty is hidden by low clouds, rain, and the gray light of the subarctic winter. The Inside Passage becomes a working waterway rather than a scenic wonder, a highway of water connecting communities that exist because of the sea, not in spite of it. Chatham Strait is probably the safest water we travel, I commented to a passenger who asked about the route. It's protected from ocean swells, the depths are moderate, and we know every rock, current, and weather pattern. If you have to be on a ferry anywhere in Alaska, this is the route you want. The Northern Light settled into her cruising speed of 16 knots, her twin diesel engines providing the steady vibration that longtime ferry passengers found comforting. The autopilot maintained our course while Captain Santos and I monitored traffic, weather, and the dozens of systems that kept the ferry operating safely. Signs of metal fatigue. At 10:30 a.m., about halfway through the crossing, Chief Engineer Tom Bradley made his routine inspection of the engine room and lower decks. Tom was a 40-year veteran of marine engineering who could diagnose problems by sound and feel long before instruments detected them. "Captain, I'm seeing something unusual down here," Tom's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room. "There's a crack in the hull plating near the port engine mount. It's small, but it wasn't there yesterday." Hull cracks on older vessels aren't unusual, especially in Alaska where thermal cycling and heavy use take their toll on steel structures. The Northern Light had undergone regular hull inspections and repairs throughout her service life, and minor cracks were typically addressed during scheduled maintenance periods. "How big is the crack?" Captain Santos asked. "Maybe 8 inches long, hairline width. Looks like metal fatigue in the weld seam. Not serious, but I wanted you to know about it. Document it with photos and measurements. We'll have the marine surveyor look at it when we reach Sitka." It was a reasonable response to what appeared to be a minor maintenance issue. The crack was small, located above the waterline, and showed no signs of active propagation. According to every protocol and regulation, the ferry was safe to continue normal operations while arranging for proper repair. The passengers' experience. While the crew dealt with routine operational issues, the passengers settled into the familiar rhythm of a ferry crossing. The Northern Lights cafeteria served coffee and sandwiches to travelers who preferred to stay inside rather than brave the February weather on deck. Sarah Rodriguez sat in the forward lounge, holding 6-month-old Emma while her husband Mark dozed in the adjacent seat. The baby had been fussy during the early morning departure from Juneau, but the ferry's motion seemed to calm her. Through the rain-streaked windows, Sarah could see the forested shores of Admiralty Island sliding past. Dr. Kim worked on patient charts in the quiet section of the passenger lounge, preparing for her clinic rotation in Sitka. The Nakamura grandparents shared photos of their grandson with other passengers, the kind of casual conversation that develops among Alaskans who regularly travel the ferry system. In the vehicle deck below, James Tompkins checked the tie-downs on his construction equipment, ensuring everything remained secure during the crossing. The vehicle deck was a cavernous space filled with cars, pickup trucks, RVs, and commercial vehicles, a cross-section of Alaska transportation needs that the ferry system accommodated without fanfare. The engineering assessment. Tom Bradley's inspection of the hull crack revealed characteristics that concerned him more than he'd initially indicated to the bridge. The crack appeared to follow the heat-affected zone of a weld, an area where the steel's metallurgical properties had been altered during the original construction or subsequent repairs. "This isn't random metal fatigue," Tom noted in his engineering log. "The crack is following a specific path that suggests the weld was compromised. Could be from thermal stress, vibration, or both." The Northern Light had been built during an era when welding standards were less stringent than modern practice. Over 40 years of service, the ferry had been subject to thermal cycling from Alaska's extreme temperature variations, structural loading from heavy seas, and the constant vibration of her engines and propulsion systems. "I'm going to increase the frequency of inspections," Tom decided. "Check this area every hour instead of every 4 hours. If it shows any sign of growth, we need to know immediately." Deceptive calm. At 11 a.m., the ferry was making excellent time towards Sitka. The weather had improved slightly, with visibility increasing and the rain diminishing to a light drizzle. Chatham Strait was living up to its reputation as a protected waterway, moderate seas, predictable currents, and no significant weather concerns. "Ide Sitka remains 12:15 p.m., I reported to Captain Santos. "All systems normal, passenger services report no issues, and Tom's monitoring the hull crack situation." "Good. Let's hope the rest of the crossing is this boring." The word boring would later haunt all of us. In maritime operations, boring is good. Boring means equipment working properly, passengers comfortable, crew performing routine duties without surprises. Boring means everyone goes home safely at the end of the day. But we were about to learn that 40-year-old ferry hulls don't always behave predictably, that metal fatigue can accelerate without warning, and that the difference between a boring crossing and a maritime emergency can be measured in the width of a crack that's growing faster than anyone anticipated. The crack grows. Tom's 11:30 a.m. inspection revealed what every marine engineer fears. The hull crack had doubled in length, extending from 8 inches to nearly 16 inches in just 1 hour. More significantly, it was beginning to penetrate deeper into the hull plating, approaching the point where it might reach the waterline. "Captain, we need to talk." Tom's voice on the intercom carried an urgency that made everyone on the bridge pay attention. "The crack situation is developing faster than I expected. I need you to see this." Captain Santos left the bridge in my care and descended to the engine room, where Tom showed her a crack that was now clearly visible and growing. The metal around the crack was showing signs of stress, slight deformation that indicated the forces acting on this section of hull were approaching the steel's limits. How long before this becomes a serious problem? Captain Santos asked. Hard to say. Could be hours, could be minutes. Crack propagation in older steel is unpredictable. But Captain, if this crack reaches the waterline and then continues below it. He didn't need to finish the sentence. A crack below the waterline meant water ingress. Water ingress in the engine room meant potential flooding of critical systems. And flooding of critical systems on a passenger ferry carrying 247 people meant a maritime emergency of the highest order. The first decision point, Captain Santos returned to the bridge with the weight of command evident in her expression. She faced the classic dilemma of ferry operations: continue to the destination as scheduled, or alter course for the nearest port to address a problem that might or might not become serious. What's our nearest safe harbor? She asked, studying the chart. Petersburg is about 25 miles northeast, I replied. Cake is closer, maybe 15 miles, but they don't have repair facilities. And Sitka? Still 40 miles southwest. If we maintain current speed, we'll be there in about 2.5 hours. The decision was complicated by factors beyond navigation. The passengers aboard the Northern Light had connecting flights, medical appointments, work obligations. Diverting to Petersburg would disrupt schedules and cost the ferry system thousands of dollars in rebooking and compensation. But continuing to Sitka with a growing hull crack risked something far more valuable than money. We reduce speed to 12 knots and continue monitoring, Captain Santos decided. Slower speed reduces structural stress on the hull. Tom, I want inspections every 15 minutes. Any further crack growth, and we immediately head for the nearest port. It was a calculated risk based on professional judgment and 40 years of the Northern Lights' reliable service. The crack was serious but not immediately threatening. The reduced speed would minimize stress on the damaged hull section. And Sitka, with its full port facilities and Coast Guard station, was the logical destination for proper assessment and repair. Passengers unaware. While the crew dealt with the developing situation, the passengers remained unaware that anything was wrong. The reduced speed was barely noticeable to people accustomed to ferry travel, and the ship's motion remained comfortable in the protected waters of Chatham Strait. Sarah Rodriguez had managed to get baby Emma to sleep and was dozing herself, lulled by the ferry's steady motion. Dr. Kim continued working on her patient files. The Nakamura grandparents were playing cards with other passengers in the main lounge. This normalcy was both blessing and burden for the crew. Keeping passengers calm and unaware of developing problems was part of professional seamanship. But it also meant that if the situation deteriorated rapidly, we might have very little time to prepare 247 people for emergency procedures they hoped never to need. The critical hour, at 12 p.m., just 15 minutes before our scheduled arrival in Sitka, Tom's inspection revealed the news we'd been dreading. The crack had reached the waterline and was beginning to extend below it. A thin stream of seawater was entering the engine room, not enough to threaten the machinery yet, but growing as the crack continued to propagate. Captain, we have water ingress, Tom reported. The crack is now below the waterline and extending. I estimate we're taking on maybe 50 gallons per minute right now, but that rate will increase as the crack grows. 50 gallons per minute was manageable for the ferry's bilge pumps, but crack propagation in fatigued metal could accelerate without warning. What started as a manageable leak could become catastrophic flooding in minutes if the crack suddenly extended through a large section of hull plating. All stop, Captain Santos ordered. Prepare to anchor if necessary. Tom, how long before the pumps can't keep up? If the crack growth stabilizes, we can handle the current rate indefinitely. But if it continues propagating... Tom paused. Captain, I think we need to start thinking about emergency procedures. And with those words, our boring Tuesday ferry crossing became something else entirely. The moment everything changed. At 12:03 p.m., 3 loud metallic pops echoed through the Northern Lights hull. Sounds like giant firecrackers that every crew member recognized instinctively as structural failure. The ferry shuddered slightly, then continued her forward motion as if nothing had happened. But in the engine room, Tom Bradley was watching disaster unfold in real time. Bridge engine room. Tom's voice crackled over the intercom with an urgency that made every passenger within earshot look up from their books and conversations. The crack just extended 30 feet in 10 seconds. We're taking on water fast, maybe 500 gallons per minute and increasing. Through the wheelhouse windows, I could see Sitka's harbor in the distance. tantalizingly close but suddenly much farther away than the 8 miles our GPS indicated. At our current speed, we were still 20 minutes from the dock. 20 minutes that we might not have if the hull breach continued to grow. All engines stop, Captain Santos ordered. Drop anchor. Tom, pump status. Both main bilge pumps are running at maximum capacity, but they're rated for 400 gallons per minute. We're already exceeding that, and the water level in the engine room is rising. The physics were simple and terrifying. Water was entering the ferry faster than we could remove it. The bilge pumps that had handled routine seepage for 40 years were no match for a catastrophic hull breach that was growing by the minute. Emergency stations, general alarm, Captain Santos commanded. All crew to emergency stations. Passengers remain seated and await instructions. The general alarm aboard a ferry is a sound designed to get attention without causing panic. A steady electronic tone that crew members recognize as the signal for emergency procedures. Throughout the Northern Light, the alarm echoed in passenger lounges, vehicle decks, and crew quarters. First Officer Walsh immediately began coordinating with the deck crew to prepare the ferry's lifeboats and life rafts. The Northern Light carried enough survival equipment for 500 people, well above our current passenger load, but launching boats in February water temperatures was a last resort that could kill people even if executed perfectly. I began plotting courses to every possible refuge within range. Sitka remained the obvious choice, but if the flooding accelerated, we might need closer options. Cake was only 12 miles away, but the small native village had limited harbor facilities. Several small bays offered potential beaching sites where we could ground the ferry before she sank, but that would mean deliberately destroying the vessel to save the passengers. The passengers begin to notice. The combination of stopped engines, dropped anchor, and general alarm finally penetrated the routine calm of ferry travel. Conversations in the passenger lounges became more urgent. Parents pulled children closer. People began looking around for crew members who could explain what was happening. Sarah Rodriguez felt the change immediately, the absence of engine vibration, the sudden stillness of a vessel that had been moving steadily for hours. Baby Emma woke up and began crying, as if she sensed the tension that was building throughout the ship. "Excuse me," Mark Rodriguez called to a passing crew member. "Is everything okay? Why have we stopped?" "We're experiencing a minor mechanical issue," the crew member replied with the professional calm that ferry personnel are trained to maintain. "The captain will make an announcement shortly." But experienced Alaska travelers like Dr. Kim and the Nakamura grandparents recognized the signs of something more serious than a minor mechanical issue. The combination of general alarm, stopped engines, and crew members moving with unusual urgency suggested a situation that was beyond routine. The engineering crisis. In the engine room, Tom Bradley was fighting a losing battle against basic physics. The hull crack had stabilized at approximately 40 feet in length, but it was now nearly 2 inches wide in some sections, a breach large enough to admit thousands of gallons per minute. "Captain, I've got both pumps running and I've rigged the emergency pump, but we're still gaining water," Tom reported. "Current rate is maybe 800 gallons per minute coming in, 600 going out. We're net positive 200 gallons per minute." 200 gallons per minute didn't sound like much, but it represented 12,000 gallons per hour. Enough water to flood critical systems and potentially compromise the ferry's stability. More importantly, the crack showed no signs of stabilizing. Metal fatigue failures often accelerate once they reach critical size, and a crack that had grown from 8 inches to 40 feet in 90 minutes could easily double again in the next hour. "Options?" Captain Santos asked. "I can try to slow the flooding by covering the crack area with collision mats and emergency patches, but I'll need help." "And Captain?" Tom paused. "If this crack extends much further, we could lose watertight integrity in multiple compartments. At that point, no amount of pumping will save the ship." The Coast Guard call. At 12:15 p.m., Captain Santos made the radio call that every ferry captain hopes never to make. Coast Guard Juneau, this is motor vessel Northern Light. We have a maritime emergency. We are taking on water due to hull failure and require immediate assistance." The response was immediate. "Motor vessel Northern Light, this is Coast Guard Juneau. What is your position and the nature of your emergency?" "We are anchored in Chatham Strait, 8 miles northeast of Sitka, position 57 degrees 18 minutes north, 135 degrees 14 minutes west. We have a catastrophic hull crack below the waterline, taking on water faster than our pumps can remove it. We have 247 passengers and 23 crew aboard. Northern Light, we copy 270 souls aboard with flooding emergency. We are launching rescue assets immediately. What is your current status? We are stable but taking on water. Estimate we can maintain current status for 1 to 2 hours depending on crack propagation. We may need to evacuate passengers to survival craft. Even saying those words felt surreal. Evacuation to survival craft in February Alaskan waters was a death sentence for some passengers, regardless of how well the operation was executed. Water temperatures in the low 40s could kill within minutes, and launching lifeboats in any conditions carried inherent risks. Passenger announcement. At 12:20 p.m., Captain Santos made her first announcement to the passengers, a carefully worded statement designed to inform without causing panic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently anchored due to a mechanical issue that our crew is working to resolve. As a precautionary measure, I'm asking all passengers to locate their life jackets, which are stored under your seats or in your cabins. This is purely precautionary, and we expect to resume our journey shortly. Please remain calm and follow any instructions from crew members. The announcement had the opposite effect from what was intended. The mention of life jackets transformed passenger concern into genuine fear. Parents began strapping life jackets on children. Elderly passengers struggled to understand instructions that crew members were suddenly rushing to help with. Sarah Rodriguez held baby Emma tighter while Mark fumbled with the life jacket designed for infants. Dr. Kim moved through the passenger area, her medical training making her a natural leader for people who were beginning to understand that their routine ferry crossing had become something much more dangerous. The crack accelerates. At 12:35 p.m., Tom's worst fears were realized. The hull crack suddenly extended another 20 feet in a matter of seconds, accompanied by the sound of tearing metal that was audible throughout the ship. The water ingress rate doubled instantly, overwhelming even the emergency pumps. Bridge engine room, we just lost the fight, Tom reported. The crack is now over 60 feet long and growing. Water ingress is approximately 1,500 gallons per minute. All pumps combined can't keep up. I estimate 15 to 20 minutes before we start losing critical systems. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. The Northern Light was now taking on nearly 100,000 gallons of water per hour, enough to flood the entire engine room in 30 minutes and potentially cause the ferry to sink within an hour. Tom, abandon the engine room and seal all possible compartments, Captain Santos ordered. We're going to try to reach shallow water before she goes down. The race for shore. With the ferry now in immediate danger of sinking, Captain Santos faced the most critical decision of her maritime career. Sitka Harbor was still 8 miles away, too far to reach before the flooding overcame the ship's stability. But there were alternatives that no ferry captain wanted to consider. Cake is 4 miles north, I reported. Water depth there is about 30 feet. We could intentionally ground her on the beach. Intentionally grounding the Northern Light would destroy the ferry but might save the passengers. In 30 feet of water, the ship would settle to the bottom with her superstructure still above water, allowing passengers to remain aboard until rescue arrived. But the maneuver required precise navigation through unfamiliar waters while the ship was flooding and potentially losing power. Plot a course for Cake, Captain Santos decided. Emergency speed. We'll beach her if necessary. The engines came back to life with the urgency that every passenger could feel. The Northern Light began moving toward shore at maximum speed, racing against the water that was flooding her hull and the structural failure that was spreading through her aging steel. Preparing for the worst, as the ferry raced toward Cake, the crew began implementing emergency procedures that they'd trained for but hoped never to use. The lifeboats were swung out and prepared for launching. Emergency equipment was distributed. Passengers were organized into groups based on their location aboard the ship. All passengers, this is your captain, Santos announced. We are proceeding to shallow water as a precautionary measure. Please put on your life jackets now and move to your assigned muster stations. Crew members will guide you. Remain calm and follow instructions exactly. The passenger response was a mixture of disciplined calm and barely controlled panic. Experienced travelers like the Nakamura grandparents moved deliberately to their muster stations, helping other passengers understand the procedures. But families with young children, elderly passengers with mobility issues, and tourists unfamiliar with maritime emergency procedures struggled to understand what was happening and what they needed to do. Sarah Rodriguez found herself separated from Mark in the confusion, holding baby Emma while trying to navigate crowded passageways filled with people moving in different directions. Dr. Kim had naturally assumed leadership of her muster group, using her medical authority to keep people calm and organized. The engineering disaster. In the engine room, Tom Bradley was fighting a losing battle against the sea itself. Water was now waist-deep around the main engines and rising fast. Electrical systems were beginning to fail as seawater reached control panels and wiring. The ferry's propulsion was still functioning, but for how much longer? "Captain, I'm losing electrical systems down here," Tom reported. Water's reached the main electrical panel. "I can keep the engines running for maybe 10 more minutes, but after that, we're dead in the water." 10 minutes at emergency speed would cover approximately 3 miles, enough to reach shallow water near Cake, but not enough to make the harbor or find an ideal beaching site. The Northern Light would have to be grounded wherever we could reach before the engines failed completely. The final approach. At 12:50 p.m., with water continuing to flood the ferry and electrical systems failing throughout the ship, the lights of Cake appeared ahead. The small native village was not equipped for ferry operations, but it offered something more valuable than a proper harbor: shallow water where a sinking ship could settle to the bottom without taking her passengers with her. "Depth sounder shows 40 feet and shoaling," I reported. "Bottom appears to be sand and gravel, good holding ground. All passengers, prepare for emergency grounding," Captain Santos announced. "Hold on to something secure. This will be rough, but we will get through this together." The Northern Light, designed for the gentle docking maneuvers of ferry terminals, was about to become a beach wreck in one of the most remote locations in southeast Alaska. But as the water rose in her hull and her systems failed around us, that beach represented the difference between rescue and tragedy. Impact. At 12:53 p.m., the Northern Light struck the gravelly bottom of Cake's outer harbor at 8 knots. The impact threw passengers from their seats and sent unsecured equipment flying through the ship. But it also stopped the ferry's motion and began the process of settling her onto the bottom in shallow water. "All stop. Secure engines," Captain Santos commanded. "Tom, abandon the engine room now." As the ferry settled onto the bottom, water continued to pour through the massive hull crack, but now it didn't matter. Instead of sinking in deep water, the Northern Light was grounding herself in 35 feet of water, shallow enough that her passenger decks would remain above the surface even when fully flooded. But we still had 247 people aboard a damaged ship in freezing weather, and rescue was still hours away. The immediate crisis had been averted, but our fight for survival was just beginning. The aftermath of grounding. When the Northern Light struck bottom in Cake's outer harbor, the immediate sensation was one of controlled violence. The ferry's momentum carried her forward across the gravel bottom for several hundred feet before she came to a grinding halt, listing slightly to port as water continued pouring through the massive hull breach. The impact threw passengers against bulkheads and sent loose items flying through compartments throughout the ship. In the passenger lounges, elderly travelers were knocked from their seats. Parents struggled to protect children from the chaos of a 4,000-ton vessel suddenly stopping after traveling at 8 knots. Sarah Rodriguez, holding 6-month-old Emma, was thrown against a bulkhead hard enough to bruise her shoulder. But the baby's crying, which had seemed so distressing moments before, was now reassuring proof that both mother and child had survived the grounding. Around her, passengers were picking themselves up, checking for injuries and trying to understand what had just happened. "Is everyone okay? Anyone hurt?" Dr. Kim called out in her muster area, immediately shifting into medical mode. Her training as a physician made her the natural leader for assessing injuries and organizing care for passengers who needed immediate attention. Throughout the ship, crew members conducted rapid head counts and injury assessments. Remarkably, the grounding had produced only minor injuries, cuts, bruises, and one suspected broken wrist among an elderly passenger who had fallen during the impact. Stabilization and assessment. Within minutes of grounding, it became clear that Captain Santos' desperate maneuver had worked. The Northern Light was sitting firmly on the bottom in 35 feet of water, with her main passenger decks still 15 feet above the surface. Water continued to flood the lower compartments, but the ferry was no longer in danger of sinking completely. Damage control report. Captain Santos called over the ship's communication system. Tom Bradley, who had evacuated the engine room just before grounding, provided the assessment. "Engine room is completely flooded, but the watertight bulkheads are holding. Water level has stabilized at the main deck level. She's not going anywhere, but she's not going down either." The engineering spaces were a total loss, filled with seawater that had destroyed the ferry's propulsion and electrical systems. But the passenger areas remained dry and relatively comfortable, though heating systems were beginning to fail as electrical power was lost throughout the ship. "How long can we maintain life support?" Captain Santos asked. "Emergency generators will provide limited power for maybe 6 hours," Tom replied. After that, we're running on battery power for essential systems only. Heat will be a major issue. Outside temperature is 34 degrees, and without the heating system, interior temperature will drop fast. The village response. The village of Cake, population 500, had never dealt with a maritime emergency of this magnitude. The sound of the northern light running aground had brought most of the village to the waterfront, where residents watched in amazement as a full-sized ferry sat stranded in their harbor. Village Public Safety Officer Robert Mills was the first official responder to reach the waterfront. Using a handheld marine radio, he established contact with the ferry. "Northern Light, this is Cake Public Safety. We saw you run aground. What assistance do you need?" "Cake Public Safety, this is Captain Santos. We have 247 passengers and 23 crew aboard. No serious injuries, but we're going to need evacuation assistance. How many small boats are available?" "Captain, we can muster maybe a dozen skiffs and fishing boats, but in this weather we can only carry 2 or 3 passengers per trip safely. It's going to take time to get everyone off." The mathematics were sobering. 12 boats making 2 or 3 passenger trips each would require 40 to 60 trips to evacuate everyone aboard the ferry. In February weather, with choppy water and air temperatures below freezing, each boat trip carried risks for both passengers and volunteer boat operators. Coast Guard response. The Coast Guard response to the Northern Light emergency was immediate and comprehensive, but the ferry's remote location complicated rescue operations. The nearest Coast Guard cutter was 4 hours away in Juneau. The rescue helicopter based in Sitka could reach the scene in 30 minutes, but it could only evacuate 2 or 3 passengers per trip. "Northern Light, this is Coast Guard Helicopter 6020, came the call over the radio. "We're inbound to your position ETA 20 minutes. We'll begin evacuating passengers with the highest priority, medical emergencies, elderly, and families with small children." The helicopter evacuation would be crucial for passengers who couldn't safely transfer to small boats, but it would take dozens of flights to evacuate everyone aboard the ferry. And weather conditions in southeast Alaska could deteriorate rapidly, potentially grounding air operations before the evacuation was complete. "Coast Guard, this is Northern Light," Captain Santos responded. "We're stable for now but losing heat fast. Estimate we can keep passengers comfortable for maybe 4 to 6 hours before hypothermia becomes a serious concern." Passenger organization. With the ferry grounded but stable, the crew began organizing passengers for what would clearly be a lengthy evacuation process. The 247 people aboard represented a cross-section of Alaska's traveling public, from healthy young adults who could easily transfer to small boats, to elderly passengers and families with infants who would need special assistance. First Officer Walsh took charge of passenger prioritization, using her 20 years of ferry experience to organize people into evacuation groups. "Medical emergencies and mobility-impaired passengers go first by helicopter," she announced. "Families with children under 5 go second. Everyone else will be evacuated by small boat as conditions permit." Dr. Kim volunteered to serve as the medical triage officer, using her clinical experience to assess which passengers needed immediate evacuation and which could safely wait. Her presence gave passengers confidence that medical needs were being addressed professionally. The Nakamura grandparents, both in their 70s, were designated for early helicopter evacuation despite their protests that younger passengers should go first. "We've lived our lives," Mrs. Nakamura told Dr. Kim. "The young family should go ahead of us. You're going first because that's how we keep everyone safe," Dr. Kim replied firmly. "We evacuate based on medical need and capability, not on who deserves it most." The first helicopter evacuation, Coast Guard Helicopter 6020, arrived at 1:30 p.m., hovering over the grounded ferry in conditions that tested the skills of both pilot and rescue swimmer. February winds gusting to 25 knots, combined with the ferry's unstable platform and the presence of hundreds of people on deck, made the operation extremely challenging. Rescue swimmer Petty Officer Lisa Martinez was lowered to the ferry's upper deck, where she immediately began assessing passengers for evacuation. Her first priorities were clear: an elderly man with chest pains, a woman using a wheelchair, and Sarah Rodriguez with baby Emma. "Ma'am, we're going to get you and your baby off first," Martinez told Sarah. "I need you to follow my instructions exactly. This rescue basket is going to feel unstable, but it's completely safe if you stay calm." The transfer of a 6-month-old infant in a rescue basket, in windy conditions, from an unstable platform was one of the most technically challenging evacuations Martinez had ever attempted. But her training and experience proved sufficient. Within 10 minutes, Both Sarah and Emma were safely aboard the helicopter and heading toward Sitka's hospital. How many more trips can you make before weather becomes a factor? Captain Santos asked the helicopter crew. We can probably get 6 or 8 more people out before we need to refuel and reassess conditions, the pilot replied. But Captain, if this wind picks up much more, we'll have to suspend helicopter operations until tomorrow. Village boat operations. While the Coast Guard helicopter evacuated high-priority passengers, the village of Cake was organizing its own rescue fleet. 12 fishing boats, skiffs, and cabin cruisers were being prepared for passenger transfer operations, a community response that demonstrated the kind of mutual aid that defines Alaska coastal communities. Northern Light, this is fishing vessel Raven's Call, came the radio call from boat captain Johnny Peters. We're coming alongside your starboard side to begin passenger transfer. How many can you send us? Raven's Call, we can send you 3 passengers this trip. Seas are moderate, but boarding will be challenging. Stand by for safety instructions. The transfer from ferry to fishing boat required passengers to climb down a rope ladder while both vessels moved independently in the choppy harbor waters. For passengers unfamiliar with maritime operations, it was a terrifying process that required courage and absolute trust in the crew managing the operation. Mark Rodriguez, separated from his wife and daughter during the helicopter evacuation, was among the first passengers to transfer to village boats. The climb down the rope ladder to the Raven's Call in freezing wind and spray was the most frightening experience of his life, but the skilled seamanship of Captain Peters and his crew made the transfer successfully. Take your time, don't look down, and trust the ladder, Peters instructed. We've been doing this our whole lives, you're in good hands. Deteriorating conditions. By 3 p.m., the evacuation had removed approximately 60 passengers from the ferry, but conditions were beginning to deteriorate. Wind speeds had increased to 30 knots, with higher gusts creating whitecaps in the harbor. The helicopter had been forced to suspend operations due to weather, and several village boats had returned to shore to wait for calmer conditions. Captain, I'm concerned about hypothermia among the remaining passengers, Dr. Kim reported. Interior temperature has dropped to about 45 degrees, and we have elderly passengers and children who are showing early signs of cold stress. The loss of the ferry's heating system was creating a secondary emergency. While the immediate danger of sinking had been averted, the 187 passengers still aboard were now facing the gradual onset of hypothermia in an unheated vessel during an Alaskan February afternoon. How long before this becomes a medical emergency? Captain Santos asked. Depends on the individual, but I'd say we have maybe 2 hours before we start seeing serious hypothermia cases. The elderly and very young are most at risk. Emergency shelter preparation. The crew began implementing cold weather survival procedures that weren't part of standard ferry operations but became necessary given the circumstances. Passengers were moved to interior spaces where body heat could be concentrated. Emergency blankets were distributed from the ferry's survival equipment stores. Everyone needs to stay together and share body heat, First Officer Walsh announced. We're going to get through this, but we need to work together to stay warm. The passenger response demonstrated the kind of resilience that Alaskans develop from living in challenging conditions. Strangers shared blankets, parents organized activities to keep children distracted, and elderly passengers contributed their experience with cold weather survival. James Tompkins, the construction supervisor, used his knowledge of building systems to help the crew identify areas where body heat could be most effectively retained. Block the passageways to the outer decks, he suggested. Concentrate everyone in the main lounge where we can use shared body heat most efficiently. The Cake community response. As word of the ferry emergency spread through Cake, the entire village mobilized to support the evacuation effort. The community center was opened as a warming facility for evacuated passengers. Village women prepared hot food and coffee for people coming off the water. Every available boat was pressed into service for passenger transfer operations. This is what we do in Alaska, Village Administrator Mary Johnson explained to a Coast Guard coordinator. When someone's in trouble on the water, the whole community responds. These ferry passengers are our neighbors now. The village's response represented more than just emergency assistance. It was a demonstration of the values that allow small communities to survive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Northern Lights passengers were experiencing firsthand the kind of mutual aid that defines Alaska coastal culture. Coast Guard cutter arrival. At 4:30 p.m., the Coast Guard cutter Liberty arrived from Juneau, bringing professional rescue capabilities and heated berthing for evacuated passengers. The 210-foot cutter could accommodate all remaining passengers aboard the ferry, but transferring 187 people from a grounded ferry to a cutter in rough conditions would require careful coordination. Northern Light, this is Coast Guard Cutter Liberty, came the radio call. We're prepared to take all remaining passengers aboard. What's your status for large-scale transfer operations? Liberty, we have 187 passengers remaining, including approximately 30 who will need assistance with the transfer. Seas are rough but manageable for boat operations. We're ready to begin transfer as soon as you are. The arrival of the Coast Guard cutter represented the beginning of the end of the emergency, but it also meant implementing the most complex phase of the evacuation. Moving nearly 200 people from ferry to cutter in deteriorating weather conditions would test the skills of both crews and the courage of passengers who had already endured hours of uncertainty. The large-scale transfer. The transfer operation from the Northern Light to the Liberty was conducted using the cutter's rigid-hull inflatable boats, ribs, which could carry 8 to 10 passengers per trip in the current sea conditions. Each transfer required precise boat handling as passengers climbed down rope ladders in conditions that were challenging even for experienced mariners. Take your time, follow the crew's instructions exactly, and don't look down, Coast Guard boatswain's mate First Class Rodriguez instructed each group of passengers. We've done this hundreds of times, you're in professional hands. Dr. Kim remained aboard the ferry until the final transfers, monitoring passengers for signs of hypothermia and ensuring that medical needs were addressed. The Nakamura grandparents, despite their earlier helicopter evacuation, had insisted on being transferred back to help with the elderly passengers who remained aboard. We're not leaving until everyone is safe, Mr. Nakamura had told the Coast Guard crew. These are our people. The final evacuations. As darkness fell on February 14th, the last passengers were transferred from the grounded Northern Light to the Coast Guard cutter Liberty. The ferry that had started the day carrying 247 people on a routine crossing was now empty except for essential crew members who remained aboard to secure the vessel and assess damage. Final passenger count aboard Liberty, 247 passengers and 20 crew members, the cutter's commanding officer reported to Coast Guard Juneau. All souls accounted for, no serious injuries, evacuation complete. Captain Santos remained aboard the Northern Light with Tom Bradley and 3 volunteer crew members, conducting a final assessment of the grounded ferry and ensuring that environmental protection measures were in place. The ferry's fuel tanks had been compromised during the grounding, and preventing a significant fuel spill was now a priority. It's going to be a total loss, Tom reported after inspecting the flooded engineering spaces. But Captain, she got everyone home safe. That's what matters. The community aftermath. By 8 p.m., all 247 passengers had been transported to either Sitka or Juneau, where they received medical evaluation, warm shelter, and assistance with continuing their travel plans. The Coast Guard cutter Liberty remained on scene to provide support for the crew members still aboard the ferry and to coordinate environmental protection efforts. In Cake, the village community was already planning long-term support for the ferry evacuation effort. The grounded Northern Light would become a navigation hazard that would need to be removed, but the village's response to the emergency had demonstrated the kind of maritime solidarity that defines Alaska coastal communities. Every single person aboard that ferry is someone's family, Village Public Safety Officer Mills reflected. When you live in Alaska, you understand that we're all in this together. The water doesn't care about your politics or your background. When someone's in trouble on the sea, you help. The investigation begins. Even as the immediate emergency was being resolved, preliminary investigations into the ferry's structural failure were beginning. Coast Guard Marine inspectors were documenting the massive hull crack that had caused the flooding, while Alaska Marine Highway System officials were reviewing maintenance records and operational procedures. This appears to be a classic case of metal fatigue in an aging vessel, the lead Coast Guard investigator noted. The crack followed the heat-affected zone of a 40-year-old weld, suggesting that thermal stress and vibration over decades of operation finally exceeded the material's endurance limit. The investigation would eventually lead to comprehensive inspections of all vessels in the Alaska Marine Highway fleet and revised maintenance procedures for aging ferries. But for the moment, the focus remained on understanding how a routine crossing had become a maritime emergency that required one of the largest passenger evacuations in Alaska's recent history. The long night, as darkness fell over Cake on February 14th, the immediate crisis of passenger evacuation was complete, but the Northern Lights ordeal was far from over. Captain Santos and her skeleton crew faced the prospect of spending the night aboard a grounded, powerless ferry in sub-freezing temperatures while ensuring the vessel's fuel didn't create an environmental disaster. Interior temperature is down to 38 degrees and dropping, Tom Bradley reported from his rounds of the ferry's systems. Emergency power is maintaining minimal lighting and communications, but we've got maybe 4 hours of battery power left. The 5 crew members who had volunteered to remain aboard, Captain Santos, Tom Bradley, First Officer Walsh, myself, and Bosun Jim Kowalski, had enough emergency rations and survival gear to last several days if necessary. But staying warm in an unheated ferry during an Alaskan winter night would test our endurance and resourcefulness. We set up a warming area in the main lounge, Captain Santos decided. Concentrate all our body heat in one space, use emergency blankets and sleeping bags from the survival equipment. Take watch turns so everyone gets some rest. The grounded ferry groaned and creaked around us as tidal action moved her slightly on the gravel bottom. Every sound made us conscious that we were aboard a damaged vessel whose structural integrity had been compromised. But the alternative, leaving the Northern Light unattended, was unacceptable given the environmental risks posed by her fuel tanks. Environmental concerns. The ferry's fuel tanks contained approximately 40,000 gallons of marine diesel fuel, and the grounding had stressed the tank structures in ways that could lead to catastrophic spills. Tom's inspection revealed several areas where fuel was seeping from damaged tank connections, creating rainbow sheens on the water around the ferry. We're losing maybe 50 gallons per hour, Tom reported. Not catastrophic yet, but if the main tank ruptures, we could have a major environmental incident. A large fuel spill in Cakes Harbor would devastate the local fishing economy and damage an ecosystem that the village depended on for subsistence. The crew's presence aboard the ferry was essential for monitoring the fuel situation and implementing emergency containment measures if the tanks failed completely. Coast Guard, this is Northern Light, Captain Santos radioed. We need an environmental response team and containment equipment as soon as possible. We're dealing with ongoing fuel leakage that could become a major spill. Northern Light, this is Coast Guard Juneau. Environmental response team is being assembled and will arrive by helicopter at first light. Can you maintain containment until then? Affirmative, but we'll need help if the situation deteriorates. The fuel transfer operation. At dawn on February 15th, Coast Guard environmental specialists arrived to assess the fuel spill risk and coordinate emergency fuel removal from the grounded ferry. The operation would require transferring 40,000 gallons of diesel fuel from damaged tanks to portable containers, a complex process complicated by the ferry's position and the ongoing fuel leaks. We need to pump out the fuel before the tanks rupture completely, environmental specialist Lieutenant Sarah Kim explained to Captain Santos. But pumping from damaged tanks in a grounded vessel is going to be technically challenging. The fuel transfer operation required bringing specialized pumping equipment to the ferry, positioning fuel barges alongside for receiving the transferred diesel, and ensuring that the pumping process didn't worsen the existing leaks. Every aspect of the operation carried environmental risks that could turn a contained spill into a major disaster. How long will the transfer take? Captain Santos asked. In ideal conditions, maybe 12 hours. But these aren't ideal conditions. We're looking at 18 to 24 hours minimum, possibly longer if we encounter complications. Media and political response. Word of the Northern Light emergency had reached state and national media, bringing unwanted attention to Alaska Marine Highway System's aging fleet and maintenance practices. Television news helicopters circled the grounded ferry while reporters interviewed passengers about their evacuation experience. This is exactly the kind of disaster we've been warning about, State Representative John Mitchell told reporters in Juneau. Alaska Marine Highway has been operating aging ferries beyond their design life while deferring critical maintenance due to budget constraints. The political implications of the ferry grounding extended beyond immediate emergency response. Alaska's ferry system was a vital transportation link for coastal communities, but it had struggled with aging infrastructure and limited funding for years. The Northern Light incident highlighted systemic problems that had been developing over decades. Governor Sarah Williams announced a comprehensive review of ferry safety procedures and pledged additional funding for vessel maintenance. The safety of Alaska's traveling public must be our highest priority, she said. This incident demonstrates that we can no longer defer critical infrastructure investments. Passenger aftermath. The 247 passengers evacuated from the Northern Light were dealing with their own aftermath from the emergency. Many had lost luggage and personal belongings when the ferry was grounded. Others faced significant disruptions to travel plans, medical appointments, and work schedules. Sarah and Mark Rodriguez, reunited with baby Emma and Sitka, were struggling with the psychological impact of the emergency. When that helicopter lifted us off the ferry, I thought we might not see Mark again, Sarah told reporters. You don't expect a routine ferry trip to turn into a life-or-death situation. Dr. Patricia Kim had missed her scheduled clinic rotation in Sitka, leaving rural patients without access to specialized medical care. The personal inconvenience is nothing compared to what could have happened, she reflected. But this incident shows how dependent Alaska communities are on ferry service for essential needs like medical care. The Nakamura grandparents, despite their age and the stress of the evacuation, had become minor celebrities for their insistence on helping other passengers during the emergency. "We've lived in Alaska for 60 years, Mr. Nakamura told a television reporter. "When people are in trouble on the water, you help. That's how we survive here." Technical investigation. The Coast Guard's investigation into the ferry's structural failure revealed a complex chain of events that had been developing over years. The hull crack had originated at a weld repair made in 1998, where thermal stress had created microscopic cracks that grew slowly over 25 years of normal operation. "This is a classic example of fatigue crack propagation in an aging structure," explained Dr. Robert Chin, a metallurgical engineer brought in to analyze the failure. "The crack probably existed in some form for years, but remained stable until thermal cycling and vibration finally caused it to reach critical size." The investigation also revealed that the ferry's inspection protocols, while meeting regulatory requirements, weren't adequate for detecting the type of slow-growing fatigue cracks that had caused the failure. New inspection technologies and procedures would be needed to prevent similar failures in other aging vessels. "We're dealing with ferries that were designed for 30-year service lives but are now operating in their 40th and 50th years, the lead investigator noted. "The structural challenges are unprecedented, and our inspection and maintenance procedures need to evolve accordingly." Community impact. The grounding of the Northern Light had immediate and lasting impacts on the communities that depended on ferry service. Cake, despite the disruption to their harbor, had demonstrated remarkable resilience and community spirit in responding to the emergency. "This emergency brought out the best in our people," Village Administrator Mary Johnson reflected. "Every boat owner, every able-bodied person in the village contributed to the evacuation effort. It shows what Alaska communities can accomplish when we work together." But the loss of the Northern Light also created transportation challenges for Southeast Alaska communities. The ferry's weekly route carried essential supplies, mail, and passengers who had no alternative means of travel. Replacing the vessel would require months of planning and significant financial investment. "People don't understand how dependent these communities are on ferry service," explained Alaska Marine Highway System General Manager Patricia Williams. "This isn't just transportation, it's a lifeline that connects isolated communities to medical care, supplies, and each other." Environmental resolution. The fuel transfer operation from the grounded Northern Light took 3 days to complete, with Coast Guard and environmental contractors working around the clock to prevent a major spill. Ultimately, 38,000 gallons of diesel fuel were successfully removed from the ferry's tanks, with only minor environmental impact from the initial leakage. "We managed to contain the spill to less than 200 gallons total," environmental specialist Kim reported. The quick response by the community and Coast Guard prevented what could have been a major environmental disaster. The successful containment operation demonstrated the effectiveness of Alaska's environmental response capabilities, but also highlighted the risks posed by aging ferry infrastructure. Future incidents might not be resolved as successfully without continued investment in response capabilities. Salvage operations. Removing the grounded Northern Light from Cakes Harbor would require a complex salvage operation involving specialized equipment and techniques. The ferry's position in shallow water, combined with her structural damage, made conventional refloating impossible. "We're looking at cutting the ferry into sections and removing her piece by piece," explained Captain Jennifer Walsh of Titan Salvage, the company contracted for the operation. "It's going to be expensive and time-consuming, but it's the only way to remove her without causing additional environmental damage." The salvage operation was estimated to cost $15 million and take 6 months to complete, a reminder that the true cost of the ferry grounding extended far beyond the immediate emergency response. The Northern Light, which had served Alaska communities faithfully for nearly 50 years, would end her service as scrap metal rather than being retired with dignity. Lessons for the future. The Northern Light incident became a catalyst for comprehensive reforms in Alaska ferry operations. New inspection protocols were implemented for aging vessels. Additional funding was allocated for fleet maintenance and replacement. Emergency response procedures were updated based on lessons learned from the evacuation operation. This incident, while traumatic for everyone involved, has made Alaska ferry operations safer for future generations, reflected Captain Santos during a legislative hearing on ferry safety. We learned that aging infrastructure requires constant vigilance and that emergency preparedness can mean the difference between tragedy and successful rescue. The incident also demonstrated the importance of community response capabilities in Alaska's remote locations. The village of Cake's immediate mobilization of boats and personnel had been crucial to the successful evacuation of passengers before weather conditions deteriorated. Personal reckonings. For the crew members who lived through the Northern Light emergency, the incident provided lessons that would shape the rest of their maritime careers. Captain Santos retired from ferry service 6 months later, citing the stress of commanding a vessel that had nearly sank with hundreds of passengers aboard. Every captain knows that structural failure is possible, she reflected. But when it actually happens, when you're responsible for nearly 300 lives and your ship is flooding, it changes how you think about risk and responsibility. Tom Bradley transferred to shore-based maintenance operations, where his experience with the ferry emergency proved valuable for training new engineers in emergency procedures. First Officer Walsh was promoted to captain and assigned to one of the newer ferries in the fleet. As for myself, the experience reinforced my respect for the unpredictable nature of maritime operations and the importance of emergency preparedness. Ferry duty might seem routine compared to other maritime careers, but the Northern Light proved that no vessel, no route, and no operation is ever truly safe from the unexpected. The investigation's conclusions. 6 months after the Northern Light ran aground in Cake's Harbor, the Coast Guard released its final investigation report, a document that would fundamentally change how America's aging ferry systems approached maintenance and safety. The findings were sobering and comprehensive, revealing systemic issues that extended far beyond a single vessel failure. The structural failure of the motor vessel Northern Light resulted from fatigue crack propagation in a critical hull weld that had been compromised for approximately 10 years, the report concluded. While the immediate cause was metallurgical failure, contributing factors included inadequate inspection protocols for aging vessels, deferred maintenance due to budget constraints, and the operation of ferries beyond their original design life. The investigation revealed that similar fatigue cracks existed in other ferries throughout the Alaska Marine Highway System fleet. Emergency inspections of all vessels led to the immediate dry docking of 3 ferries for structural repairs and the implementation of enhanced inspection protocols across the entire system. We discovered that we were essentially conducting a real-time experiment in operating maritime infrastructure beyond its intended lifespan, admitted Alaska Marine Highway System Director Patricia Williams. The Northern Light incident forced us to confront the reality that our fleet was aging faster than we were addressing the associated risks. The human cost. While the Northern Light emergency had ended without loss of life, the psychological impact on passengers and crew was significant and lasting. Many of the 247 passengers experienced post-traumatic stress related to their evacuation experience, particularly those who had been transferred by rope ladder to village boats in rough conditions. Sarah Rodriguez, who had been evacuated by helicopter with 6-month-old Emma, struggled with anxiety about traveling for months after the incident. Every time I hear a ferry horn or see a Coast Guard helicopter, I'm back on that ship, holding my baby and wondering if we were going to make it home, she explained to a counselor. Dr. Patricia Kim used her experience from the emergency to develop emergency medical protocols for Alaska ferry operations. Being the de facto medical officer during that evacuation taught me how unprepared we were for maritime medical emergencies, she said. I've worked with Alaska Marine Highway to improve medical training and equipment on all their vessels. The Nakamura grandparents, whose courage during the evacuation had made them local heroes, used their experience to advocate for improved ferry safety. We almost lost our chance to watch our grandson grow up, Mrs. Nakamura reflected. No family should have to face that kind of fear during what's supposed to be routine travel. Financial and political consequences. The Northern Light incident cost Alaska taxpayers an estimated $45 million in direct costs, $15 million for salvage operations, $12 million for emergency response, $8 million for passenger compensation and alternative transportation, and $10 million for immediate safety improvements to other ferries in the fleet. But the indirect costs were even more significant. The loss of the Northern Light reduced ferry capacity on critical routes, forcing Alaska Marine Highway to lease expensive replacement vessels while planning for new construction. The incident also triggered federal oversight that led to additional regulatory requirements and compliance costs. This single incident probably set back Alaska ferry modernization by 5 years, observed maritime policy analyst Dr. James Peterson. The immediate safety expenditures consumed funding that had been allocated for new vessel construction and fleet expansion. The political consequences were equally significant. Governor Sarah Williams lost her re-election bid partially due to voter concerns about ferry safety and transportation infrastructure. The incident became a symbol of Alaska's struggle to maintain essential services while dealing with budget constraints and federal oversight. Technological changes. The Northern Light emergency accelerated the adoption of new technologies for monitoring vessel structural integrity. Alaska Marine Highway became one of the first ferry systems in North America to implement real-time crack detection systems on all vessels, using sensors that could detect structural changes before they became critical. We learned that visual inspections, even when conducted regularly and professionally, aren't adequate for detecting slow-growing fatigue cracks in aging structures, explained Chief Engineer Tom Bradley, who had transitioned to fleet-wide maintenance oversight. The new monitoring systems give us early warning of problems that previously would have been invisible until they became critical. The incident also led to improvements in emergency communication systems, passenger tracking during evacuations, and coordination between ferry crews and Coast Guard rescue assets. Training scenarios based on the Northern Light emergency became standard throughout the Alaska Marine Highway system. Community resilience. The village of Cake emerged from the ferry emergency with enhanced reputation and capabilities for maritime emergency response. The community's immediate mobilization of boats and personnel had been crucial to the successful passenger evacuation, demonstrating the importance of local resources in Alaska's remote locations. The Northern Light emergency showed what Alaska communities can accomplish when we work together, reflected Village Public Safety Officer Robert Mills. Every boat owner, every able-bodied person in the village contributed to saving those passengers. It's something we're proud of. The incident led to formal agreements between Alaska Marine Highway and coastal communities for emergency response support. Villages like Cake received training and equipment for assisting with maritime emergencies, creating a network of community-based response capabilities throughout southeast Alaska. But the ferry grounding also created long-term challenges for Cake. The salvage operation disrupted the village's fishing and tourism economy for 6 months. Environmental concerns from the fuel spill, while ultimately minimal, required ongoing monitoring and remediation efforts. Fleet modernization. The Northern Light incident provided political momentum for long overdue Alaska Marine Highway fleet modernization. The state legislature approved funding for 2 new ferries to replace aging vessels, marking the first major fleet expansion in over a decade. The Northern Light tragedy became a catalyst for investments we should have made years earlier, acknowledged State Transportation Commissioner David Miller. Sometimes it takes a crisis to generate the political will for essential infrastructure spending. The new ferries incorporated lessons learned from the Northern Light emergency, including enhanced structural monitoring systems, improved emergency evacuation capabilities, and redundant safety systems designed to prevent single-point failures. The vessels also featured improved medical facilities and communication systems based on the evacuation experience. Environmental legacy. The successful containment of fuel spillage from the grounded Northern Light demonstrated both the effectiveness of Alaska's environmental response capabilities and the ongoing risks posed by aging maritime infrastructure. The incident led to enhanced fuel containment systems on all Alaska ferries and improved coordination between ferry operators and environmental response teams. We were fortunate that weather conditions and quick response prevented a major environmental disaster, noted environmental specialist Lieutenant Sarah Kim, who had coordinated the fuel transfer operation. But this incident showed how quickly a transportation emergency can become an environmental crisis in Alaska's sensitive marine ecosystems. The grounding site in Cake's Harbor was eventually restored to natural conditions after the salvage operation, but the incident prompted comprehensive environmental risk assessments for all Alaska ferry routes. New procedures were implemented for fuel management, emergency response, and environmental protection during maritime emergencies. Personal transformations. The crew members who lived through the Northern Light emergency found their careers and perspectives fundamentally changed by the experience. Captain Maria Santos, despite her successful handling of the crisis, retired from Ferry Command 6 months after the incident. Every captain knows that vessel emergencies are possible, but when you actually experience catastrophic structural failure with nearly 300 souls aboard, it changes how you think about risk and responsibility, Santos reflected. I saved everyone's life that day, but I also learned that some experiences stay with you forever. First Officer Jennifer Walsh was promoted to captain and assigned to one of the new ferries, where her experience from the Northern Light emergency proved invaluable for training crews in emergency procedures. "Every day I'm reminded that routine operations can become emergencies without warning," she said. "That knowledge makes me a better captain and a more careful mariner." Tom Bradley's expertise in emergency engineering became legendary throughout the Alaska ferry system. He developed new training programs for ferry engineers based on the lessons learned from keeping critical systems running during the flooding emergency. The ongoing challenge. 7 years after the Northern Light ran aground in Cakes Harbor, Alaska Marine Highway continues to grapple with the challenges of operating aging vessels in one of the world's most demanding maritime environments. The incident served as a wake-up call about infrastructure risks, but it also demonstrated the professionalism and courage of maritime workers and coastal communities. The Northern Light emergency taught us that ferry safety isn't just about following regulations. It's about understanding that every crossing carries the potential for the unexpected, reflected current Alaska Marine Highway Director Robert Chin. "Our job is to be prepared for emergencies that we hope never occur." The incident also highlighted the essential role that ferry systems play in Alaska's transportation network. For communities scattered across thousands of miles of coastline, ferries aren't just convenient transportation. They're lifelines that connect isolated populations to medical care, supplies, and each other. Lessons for maritime safety. The Northern Light incident became a case study in maritime emergency management, taught in Coast Guard training programs and maritime academies throughout North America. The successful evacuation of 247 passengers from a grounded ferry in challenging conditions demonstrated both the importance of emergency preparedness and the effectiveness of coordinated response. This incident shows that successful maritime emergency response requires 3 elements: professional crew training, community support capabilities, and well-coordinated rescue resources, analyzed Captain Ret. Patricia Morrison, who studied the evacuation for the Maritime Administration. When all 3 elements work together, even catastrophic equipment failures can be survived without loss of life. The incident also reinforced the importance of maintaining aging maritime infrastructure and the risks associated with operating vessels beyond their design life. These lessons proved relevant not just for Alaska ferries, but for aging ferry systems throughout the United States and around the world. The final reckoning. Ferry duty was supposed to be boring, routine transportation in protected waters with minimal risk and predictable operations. For nearly 50 years, the Northern Light had fulfilled that promise, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers safely between Alaska communities without serious incident. But on February 14, 2023, the accumulated stresses of 5 decades of Alaska service found the weakest point in an aging hull and reminded everyone aboard that no maritime operation is ever truly routine. When steel finally gave way to physics, when freezing water rushed through a crack that grew from pencil width to catastrophic in a matter of hours, the difference between tragedy and survival came down to the decisions made by people who refused to give up. The 247 passengers who were evacuated from the grounded ferry went home with stories of Coast Guard heroism, community response, and professional seamanship under pressure. But they also went home with the knowledge that their boring ferry ride had become a fight for survival in waters that could kill within minutes. The Northern Light herself lies on the bottom of Cakes Harbor, cut into pieces and removed as scrap metal, an inglorious end for a vessel that had served Alaska faithfully for half a century. But her legacy lives on in improved safety procedures, new inspection technologies, and the knowledge that even routine operations require constant vigilance and professional competence. Ferry duty might be boring most of the time, but the Northern Light proved that when boring becomes extraordinary, everything depends on the courage and skill of people who understand that their job is to bring everyone home safely, no matter what the sea throws at them. This is the story of how a crack in aging steel became a test of human resilience, and how 247 people discovered that sometimes the difference between routine travel and maritime emergency is measured in millimeters of metal fatigue that finally found its breaking point 200 miles from the nearest help.